Hi, this is Tutor P, and this is Lesson 8. Today we will look at the difference between homemade versus handmade. Yeah, this especially comes up in class. I think especially when people hear handmade, sometimes they will raise their hand and say, well, what's the difference between homemade and handmade? Yeah, sometimes there could be a little bit of a crossover, but there are clearly differences sometimes on how we use them and which ones they use. And there is definitely a different focus. Homemade is focused here. We could say homemade is used with products made at home rather than bought in a store. Yeah. So again, the focus is that you just did it at home. The term homemade is especially used with food. So for example, that is a homemade pie Sally brought into the office today. Again, the focus is that you did it at home yourself, and it's not one from the store. But just like I say a little bit later, homemade really doesn't focus on the fact of being particularly creative. It could just be an ordinary pie. Although people do appreciate sometimes that you made it at home. Sometimes it tastes better. You might have less preservatives in it. It might be healthier ingredients. Sometimes they actually do taste better. Quite often they'll be fresher. So people do appreciate it. But even if somebody made a homemade pie, if they wanted to sell it, they probably couldn't sell it for much higher than just like a normal store-bought pie. You might have homemade cakes and pies at like church sales or something like that. They can't really ask for a higher price, even though people do appreciate them. And like I say, sometimes they're just simply ordinary. Okay. All right. Anyway, other examples would be homemade cake, homemade ice cream, homemade bread. These are some of the more common examples that come up, etc. Handmade is used with products made by a person rather than a machine. Especially a lot of products that normally might be made by a machine, but now somebody has uniquely done it with their skills. So, especially using one's hands and tools. Alright, so homemade items are thought of as requiring special skills. Alright, so this part is key. And therefore are usually more expensive than those made from a machine or a mold. So you often hear when somebody's selling something and they're telling, oh, it's handmade. Oh, handmade, it must be better quality, or it's more unique. You can't find one like that in a store. Like I said, maybe it's the person who's made it. We often think of them as being very artistic or creative. So let's look at the example. Jack bought a handmade rocking chair for Grandma. All right, this is another thing we use a lot with furniture. So maybe like a homemade table, homemade rocking chair. Ones like that. So other common examples are homemade handicrafts. In the U.S. we have a lot of fairs that are just handicraft fairs. They only allow vendors who actually made their own products to go there. They don't actually want people that might have just got stuff that was made in a factory in a mold, because they expect and they hope to get better prices. They're pushing the idea that it's more unique, it's more creative. And maybe the one that they're selling to you, chances are that it could be very unique, it could be one of a kind, or even if they did make some copies of it, there's probably not like thousands of them out there that could have been made in a factory. So therefore, again, they require a higher price. Sometimes handmade jewelry might even be signed, and that's one thing I've often noticed. If it is signed, that's another thing that it could almost turn it into a collector's item if the artist were to become famous. Or handmade baskets, we might say that. You might even remember, we use handmade pottery a lot. I don't know if anybody remembers that very old movie Ghost with Demi Moore and Patrick Swayze, they had a love scene there where she was actually forming and shaping it, with her hands. So we might say handmade pottery sometimes too. Okay, again, just to kind of review a little bit. So with homemade, the focus is more on the fact that it was made at home as opposed to being a store-bought item. I'm not trying to say that some homemade stuff does not necessarily is not necessarily creative, but that's not where the focus is. Special or creative skills are not focused on. All right, so another good one to look at that might help a little bit. Even though technically I think we should really say handmade card, like a greeting card, like a handmade birthday card. We should probably really use that term more. I sometimes do hear people say homemade card. But if we hear homemade card, we might think of it as being more basic or simple. Something a child might make. If a child made a card for their mother, it might be very simple, white, and they might draw a cute little picture on it. But we don't think of it as being very 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 artistic or very very detailed. Where if you made it is possible though, you could make a handmade card with all kinds of detail, something sewn in it. It could be one of those pop-up sort of cards. Somebody could have really put a lot of work in it. So if we said a handmade like birthday card or a greeting card as opposed to a homemade one, again, this is one where somebody probably we think of them as having more talent and being more creative and probably putting a lot more work into it. Homemade would be probably pretty simple. They might say a few words, like I said, especially one that a child might make, and they might draw a cute picture. And I'm sure a mother might love it, just as much as even a store-bought one, probably a lot more. But again, handmade focuses on the idea of a lot of detail and creativity. It has an artistic feeling to it. Okay, well, I hope that helps clear up the difference between homemade and handmade. Thank you very much.